still need a handout, Brittany?
Yeah.
Okay. And everyone's going to listen intently, because I don't lecture very much, do I?
No.
So when I do, it should be engaging and useful. Okay, let's talk about assessments. Let's talk about rubrics. Let's talk about what you've learned so far. How many of you have ever had a class on assessments or rubrics? Raise your hand. Okay, stop, Jeremy, and we're about to give you your full attention.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, faces, eye contact, all that good stuff, I know. How many of you ever had, I'll say my question again, a little bit more slowly. How many of you have ever had a class on assessments or rubrics? You have? What class did you have?
Well, I was originally signed up, which I never wanted, was the EC, and I never wanted to be in it, but I did take that assessment class.
What did you think of that class?
It was actually very useful. I'm actually not mad that I took it.
Look at that! The 165, I was actually going to make that point, Laura, is that in early childhood we actually have a class called Observation and Assessment. And I've taught that class before, and it's very interesting to me that most of the teacher prep students do not have a class on observation and assessment. And that's, I think, unfortunate because that is really important. All right, Jeremy, you raised your hand. What class have you had related to assessment?
When we took EDU 321 with Nina, she went over a lot of assessment pieces.
So Nina did that, right?
Yeah.
But in the teacher prep program, do you have a class about assessment?
No.
No, you don't. So when you're out in the classroom and you're doing your job and you're the classroom coach or you're packing pieces or you're, whoever you're going to be, your agent operations, when you're out there and you're doing your thing, how much time do you think you're going to spend assessing kids? Little? Lot?
Daily.
Yeah,
all the time. And it's always struck me as kind of, as maybe a flaw that we don't have a whole class devoted to how do I assess kids? How do I figure out what they know? How do I design assignments? How do I design a rubric? One of the things when I'm hiring somebody to teach in the college for the first time and they assign their first paper, this always happens. I have this little discussion. I say, well, how are you going to grade their paper? I don't know. I'm not really sure how I'm going to grade their paper because I've never really graded papers before. And wait until you guys have that experience with your first real red pen. Usually we don't use red anymore, but it's like, what? I'm not sure how I'm going to assess. So there's a lot of really good information about how to do rubrics and how to do checklists. But I want to ask you, has anyone ever had the experience before where they just get a grade from a teacher and there's not a whole lot of explanation? Has anyone had that experience?
Peter.
Huh? Don't name names. Okay. She said nothing. Okay. All right. So,
we didn't hear it.
So will you just get like a big A? And it doesn't happen as much as it used to happen. But you might just get an A on your paper. You might just get a C. And of course, you're thinking to yourself, what are you thinking?
Why?
Why?
How?
Why? How? Right? And so rubrics really answer that, right? They're going to help us because they're going to give us a guide for what we should grade on. Now, when do you want to get the rubric? Do you want to get the rubric at the end after the teacher's graded you? When do you want the rubric?
Right in the beginning before you write the actual...
Right, so you know what the criteria is about. You know what the expectations are. So let me ask you guys, when you're thinking about, I actually love this, when you're thinking about writing a rubric, there's a couple of lessons I've learned over the years of teaching that are very useful to me. I love this cartoon. It says down here, but he's supposed to tell everyone how much you weigh. Da-dun-dun. Okay, so she's mad because, he's announced her weight or whatever. And my point here is that sometimes we're sensitive about particular things. And most students do not like negative feedback. How many of you love negative feedback? I mean, I know we've talked a lot about that in this class, that you need to be able to accept criticism. But I'm going to tell you, there's something I've learned over time that a lot of it is the way that you phrase it. So if I put this, the student, or how about this, the paper had little detail. Okay, if I put that into my rubric, all right, I am going to get, and I check this or circle this, it is very possible that a student might come and argue with me and say, well, look, I had detail. Look at this. This is detail. But what if I put this? The paper had some detail. No arguments. What did I change?
One word.
One word. I changed little to some. They're not going to argue with me. And it is amazing. When you have a rubric and it's really negative, or there's a lot of negative language, like it didn't have enough creativity, it didn't have enough detail, it didn't have enough support, it had poor writing. I see that all the time in rubrics. It had spotty mechanics or whatever. Whenever it's negative, you are going to have students and parents that argue with you. But if you phrase it positively, but you say something like it had some detail, it had some support, it had some evidence of good writing mechanics, nobody argues. Okay? So that's one of the first things that I found is if I'm going to do rubrics, I'm writing everything in positive phrasing, with the exception of the last column. What can you do in the last column where you're scoring it to be the least amount of points? What can you do there? There you can be negative, okay? Because the student has, I always put in that last one, the student did not meet expectations. The student did not meet expectations. The student did not meet expectations. Because I've used my other columns to define what all those expectations are. And I'm pretty confident if I'm circling that last column, that they're getting some points. I mean that they're not getting it. Okay, make it measurable. Okay, here's what I see a lot. What does that say?
Student did a great job.
Yeah, big smile face. What's the problem?
You're not telling them what they did so great on.
You're right. How about this? Let's say that we're working with little ones, and this is where I would tend to see this more often, like K, 1, 2, and especially kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. How about this? The student needed no help from the teacher. Do you see the difference there? They were able to work independently without extra direction. So that simple change makes a big difference when you're actually designing a rubric. So it's a much more specific thing. Look at the rubrics that I gave you. There's one that's more K1 and 2.
Making a map?
This one. And what I've done here is I've included just 3 different kinds of faces. I did my best. And that is actually still a little bit, I think I would put here instead, I worked independently from the teacher now in this category. I needed a little help. I needed lots of help from the teacher. Can you see how those are more measurable things? Okay. And then look, I've got actually underneath that, if you look at this first column, it says, followed the directions on the activity sheet, typed my name, created my self-portrait in paint. So I've got specific things here that the students actually have to be able to do. So I'm not just saying to the student, I want you to go on paint, and I want you to type your name and draw a picture in paint, but I'm actually giving them a rubric that they would follow so I could see how they were doing. Okay? I know lots and lots and lots of teachers who initially, when they're designing rubrics, design something that is not measurable. They have in their head an idea, a kind of idea about what the final product might be, but they haven't worked it all out. How many of you have ever been in a class before and you say to the teacher, well, what really are your expectations for the final unit? Or what do you really want this paper to look like? And they just say, just go with what you got. You ever had, how many people have had that happen?
They still do it in Baker.
Right, okay, yeah, a lot of teachers. Remember, a lot of teachers are not from a college of education. Go with what you got, you know? And then when you get the paper back and it's a big C, you're frustrated. Why? You went with what you had, or you went with what your ideas are. And that's why with the whole lesson planning rubric, was I tough on your grade? I was pretty tough. But I gave you an opportunity to see what my expectations were, to see where you didn't meet expectations, and then to do the revisions for better grades. Okay? So that's my point, is that you've got to make it measurable. You've got to give them a lot of direction in their rubrics. Okay. Emphasize content versus presentation. This one used to move around, and you've got the lights like flashing. Woo. Okay, now I was teaching a mistake. My first year out, I had this project where I had my seniors working on designing all these PowerPoints. That was when PowerPoint was new and fresh. My gosh, I'm dated. Okay, so they were making PowerPoints about economics for 4th graders. And so I had this one kid who did this whole presentation on The Simpsons. And he was explaining market scarcity with The Simpsons. I mean, I was so impressed with him. He was kind of a computer geek, and he made it spin, and it flipped around, and it was all hyperlinked together. And I thought it was awesome, and I was so excited about it. And I brought it down to the 4th grade teacher in our district, and she opened it up, and the first time I was like, oh my gosh. All of a sudden, as soon as she looked at it, it was grammatical error, mechanics, problems, like incorrect information. Sometimes we get really caught up on the flashy lights, woo, right? Okay? The technology, because the technology is really cool, but we're not really emphasizing content. We're not really looking at content. So one of the things I usually do when I'm working with students is I say, you know, in PowerPoint, start off in the outline view. Don't add any bells and whistles, because those bells and whistles aren't worth a whole lot. I want you instead to just go ahead and focus on content first so that you've got accurate facts. You know, you've got accurate information. So focus on content in your rubric, okay? Now this is really, really important. A lot of people do not know, they make every category in their rubric worth the same amount. And I'm going to show you an example. This is like a typical rubric. Everybody look at the making a map. Okay? Which one of these things do you think are related to content and which things are related to the actual presentation? What do you think?
Say it one more time.
Which ones are related to content and which ones are related to presentation? Content, meaning like it's actually about the map itself and getting things correct on the map versus it's about the way it looks.
The neatness and color is obviously the way it looks.
So that would be actually presentation. So if you want to code that with a P, you've got one rubric criteria that's got a P. And then what about the rest? What about content? What do you think?
All the rest of them are content.
All the rest would be content. So that would be a C, C, C. So if you looked at this and you actually had to do a percentage, what percentage would be related to presentation?
20.
About 20%. And what percentage would be related to content? 80%. And in high school, this would be an appropriate, or secondary, this would be an appropriate mix. Is it out of battery or something?
No, I was just filming
Oh, you're
the
looking
rubric.
at that. Okay. But in elementary school, you could actually, I've heard before, you can do a 40-60 split. So you can look a little bit more at presentation, especially as you're teaching them the technology skills, and a little bit less at content. But I think it's really important that you're thoughtful about this. How much of this needs to be related to content? And remember, let's go back to our Mager book and criteria again. Let's think about criteria for a second and what Mager said. Remember, especially when we're looking at math, we're always asking ourselves, what percentage is successful? Are we successful if 60% of the kids meet expectations? Are we successful if 100% meets expectations? Those are difficult conversations we need to be having with ourselves in the rubric. When you are listing out your expectations here in the rubric, it makes a big difference. It says here, at least 90% of the items are labeled accurately, and that's how you would get full points. Under 3, 80 to 89% are labeled accurately. Under 2, 79 to 70. And what I try to do is make my columns at least 4 across. And I always think of this as A,